Sometimes you do what you have to do. For Nora McKinnon, that meant watching her mother fade away like a photograph left in the sun, listening to her breath catch and rattle in the small, quiet cabin. It meant feeling the cold dread creep in as creditors circled their home like buzzards waiting for the last twitch. And it meant making a choice no 19-year-old girl should ever have to make. She was going to marry a stranger. A monster, some said. His name was Kieran Blackidge. He was a giant of a man who owned the biggest ranch in the territory, a man who solved his problems with his fists. People in Cedar Ridge didn't just respect him, they feared him. They crossed the street to avoid the shadow he cast. But Nora didn't have the luxury of fear. It was either walk up to that man's door and sell her future, or watch the bank auction off her dying mother's home, the last piece of the world her father had built. So she would walk. What the town whispered about in saloons and over sewing circles was only half the story. They didn't know that Kieran Blackidge, the brute, the hermit, had been watching Nora for months. He'd seen her in the church gardens, her auburn hair catching the light as she coaxed life from the stubborn soil. He'd seen her patience, her quiet strength, her kindness to others when she had so little herself. He had already decided to help her, long before she ever thought to ask. He just didn't know how. A marriage proposal, a desperate bargain from a woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders, was not what he expected. But it was an answer to a prayer he'd never dared to speak. A way to save her without wounding her pride. A way to ease the crushing loneliness he'd carried for 15 long years. The morning sun sliced through the dusty window of the McKinnon cabin, illuminating the hand-carved wooden cross above her mother's bed. It was her father's last gift, whittled from a piece of cedar during the final weeks before consumption stole his breath 2 winters ago. Nora traced the smooth, worn wood with her fingertip, a familiar ritual that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Her mother's breathing was a shallow, ragged sound in the stillness of the room, each pained inhale a tick of a clock counting down their final hours in this place. "Mama," Nora whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Can you try a little broth?" She lifted Margaret's frail body, propping her against pillows stuffed with dried prairie grass, the faint scent of summer, a cruel memory of healthier times. Margaret McKinnon's eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a faded cornflower sky, the same eyes that had stolen her father's heart and sealed his fate with a family that would never accept his Irish bride. "My sweet girl," Margaret rasped, her voice as thin as a dragonfly's wing. "You're wearing yourself to the bone for an old woman." Nora managed a weak smile, spooning the lukewarm liquid toward her mother's pale lips. "Hush now. Doc Henley says the new medicine from Denver could help. If we can pay for it." Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, to the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the mountains. "Child, we both know there's no money for miracles." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the weary resignation of a life filled with too many goodbyes. Nora's throat felt like it was closing up. The debt had been a small crack after her father died, but it had grown into a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. Medical bills, the mortgage, the tab at the general store. $300. In Cedar Ridge, a town booming with the promise of the railroad, $300 was a fortune for a girl whose only assets were calloused hands and a stubborn heart. It might as well have been 3,000. The knock on the door came just after 10. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was sharp, official, the sound of judgment. Nora's hands trembled as she set down her mending. She smoothed the worn fabric of her skirt and opened the door to face her demons. 2 of them. One was tall and thin, with spectacles that made his eyes look like a bug's. The other was short and thick, with a cold, dead stare that seemed to calculate the value of the nails in the porch boards. "Miss McKinnon," the tall one said, consulting a pocket watch.
I am Harold Wickham, from the First National Bank. This is Mr. Graves. We're here to discuss your outstanding obligations. Gentlemen, Nora's voice was surprisingly steady. My mother is resting. This isn't a good time. Mr. Graves took a heavy step forward, his boot heel cracking a loose board. Ma'am, with all due respect, the good times have passed. The bank has sent 6 notices. He thrust a paper into her hand. The numbers swam in front of her eyes. 327, 15, a death sentence in black ink. How long? The question was a surrender.
1 week, Graves said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. 7 days to pay the full amount. Or we evict. The property will be sold at auction. 7 days? Nora's control finally broke. But my mother, she can't be moved. She's dying. Wickham offered a sliver of pity. I sympathize, Miss McKinnon. Truly. But business is business. After they left, the silence in the cabin was heavier than before. Margaret had heard everything. Her fever-bright eyes met Nora's. The bank, Mama, Nora whispered. We have 1 week. A single tear traced a path through the lines on Margaret's cheek. I'm sorry, Nora. Your father and I, we never meant for this. Don't. Nora knelt by the bed, clutching her mother's hand. You and Papa gave me everything that mattered. This is not your fault. But the words felt hollow. Desperation was a physical thing, a clawing beast in her chest. She walked to town later that day, each step feeling like she was wading through thick mud. The chatter and bustle of Main Street felt like a different world. Everyone knew their business. In a town this small, poverty was a public spectacle. She saw Mrs. Patterson from the hotel, who sadly confirmed she had no work until spring. She passed the church, knowing Father Miguel had only prayers to offer. It was as she passed the cattleman's saloon that she heard it. The fragments of conversation drifted out through the swinging doors, carried on a cloud of cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Blackidge is the richest man in the territory, one voice boomed. And mean as a cornered rattlesnake, another shot back. Lost his wife and baby years ago, a third voice added, quieter. That kind of grief, it changes a man. Lives all alone in that big house. More money than God, and no one to share it with. Nora stopped dead on the boardwalk. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of a terrible, impossible idea. Kieran Blackidge, the giant everyone feared. The man with more money than he knew what to do with. The man who lived like a hermit, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. It was madness. Pure, unadulterated madness. She knew nothing about him but the whispers and the fearful glances. But as she stood there, the foreclosure notice crinkling in her pocket, madness felt like the only path left. It felt like hope. That night she watched her mother sleep, her face a fragile, translucent mask in the lamplight. Mama, she said softly when Margaret's eyes opened. What if I told you I found a solution? Margaret's gaze sharpened. What kind of solution? A marriage, Nora said, the word tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. A practical arrangement. Not that Billy Harper boy, I hope. Margaret managed a weak smile. He means well, but he has the sense of a stump. No, Mama, not Billy. Someone else. Someone with means. Marriage should be for love, my dear. Sometimes, Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. Love is a luxury we can't afford. Margaret was silent for a long time, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Then, she squeezed Nora's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. If he is a decent man, Nora, if he will treat you with respect, you have my blessing. I will not leave this world knowing you are alone. Sleep did not come. Nora lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in her own heart. Tomorrow, she would walk to the Black Ridge Ranch. She would stand before a monster of a man, and offer him her life in exchange for her mother's. She would need a courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But as the first pale light of dawn touched the mountains, she rose from her bed. The time for fear was over. The Black Ridge Ranch was less a home and more a fortress. It stood on a rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story monument to one man's iron will. The house was solid, imposing, built to withstand anything the world could throw at it. As Nora's worn boots crunched on the gravel drive, her carefully constructed courage threatened to shatter. This was a different world, a world of wealth and power she couldn't comprehend. She smoothed the front of her best dress, a simple blue cotton her mother had helped her mend. It was clean, but it hung on her thin frame, a testament to months of missed meals and sleepless nights. The oak door was massive, the brass knocker cold and heavy in her trembling hand. She knocked 3 times, the sound echoing in the vast, unnerving quiet. She heard footsteps, heavy, measured. The door swung inward, and she found herself staring up into the face of Kieran Blackidge. The stories hadn't lied about his size. He filled the doorway, a mountain of a man with shoulders as wide as the cabin she'd just left. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the green of a forest after a storm, deep and unsettling. They took her in, from the patched hem of her dress to the frantic pulse she could feel beating in her throat. He knew who she was. Miss McKinnon. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than she'd imagined. This is an unexpected visit, Mr. Blackidge. She managed a clumsy curtsy, her mother's lessons in deportment a flimsy shield against her terror. I apologize for the intrusion. I have a business matter to discuss. A flicker of something, curiosity, surprise, crossed his face. He stepped back, gesturing her inside. Please, come in. The parlor was overwhelming. Rich leather, polished wood, a stone fireplace big enough to roast an ox, and books. Hundreds of them, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. This was not the den of an uneducated brute. It was the study of a scholar. But there was a coldness to the room. No family portraits, no trinkets, no sign of a woman's touch. It was a house, not a home. Please sit. He indicated a leather armchair. May I get you some coffee? The simple kindness of the offer almost undid her. This was not the man from the stories. Coffee would be lovely, thank you. While he was gone, she noticed a chess set by the window, the pieces arranged mid-game. He'd been playing against himself. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. He returned with a silver tray, the china delicate, the biscuits on the plate looking like they'd come from a fine city bakery. His hands, though large and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he poured the coffee. Mrs. Holay, my housekeeper, she insists on baking, he said, almost apologetically. Far more than one man can eat. Nora took a biscuit, the buttery pastry melting on her tongue. It was the richest thing she'd tasted in months. He settled into the chair opposite her, his presence filling the space between them. Now, Miss McKinnon, what brings you all the way out here? Her rehearsed speech evaporated. The words felt foolish and desperate in this grand, silent room. She took a breath and plunged ahead. Mr. Blackidge, I am in a difficult situation. My family. We owe the bank $327. We have 6 days to pay it, or we lose our home. My mother is dying. I have no way to earn that much money in time. His expression didn't change, but she saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped his coffee cup. I am sorry for your troubles. How can I help you? The direct question threw her. I have a proposition, a business arrangement. His green eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Marriage, she blurted out, the word hanging in the air between them. A marriage of convenience. It would solve my financial problems. In return, I could provide you with companionship, a wife to manage your home. The silence that followed was deafening. She could hear the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each second an eternity. She braced herself for laughter, for anger, for him to throw her out. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "That's quite a proposition. What makes you think I am in need of a wife?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "The town, they say you live alone. I assumed, perhaps you are lonely." "And what do you get out of this, besides the money?" he pressed. "Security," she said, her voice a little stronger. "And the peace of mind of knowing my mother can live out her final days in her own home, with dignity." He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "You're a young woman, Miss McKinnon. You should be marrying for love." "Love," she said, the word tasting like ash, "is a luxury I cannot afford." He turned back, and for the first time, she saw something other than stoic control in his face. It was a deep, profound sadness, a vulnerability that shocked her. "You don't know me," he said softly. "The stories they tell in town, they're mostly true." "I know that you built this ranch from nothing," she countered, finding a sudden surge of courage. "I know that you have books on poetry and philosophy, and I know that you offered a stranger coffee instead of turning her away. That is enough for me." He studied her for a long, silent moment, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking directly into her soul. "What are the terms?" "I will be your wife in every practical sense," she said, her voice steady. "I will run this house. I will be your hostess. I will perform all the duties expected of me. In return, you pay our debts and allow my mother to live here with us until the end." "And after your mother is gone?" The question was heavy with unspoken meaning. "Then, we continue as we are, until the arrangement no longer suits one of us." He walked to his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened a drawer and took out a pen and a sheet of paper. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Very well, Miss McKinnon. If this is what you truly want, I accept your proposition." The news hit Cedar Ridge like a bolt of lightning. Nora McKinnon, the quiet girl from the sad little cabin, had somehow landed Kieran Blackidge. The town buzzed with gossip. Had she trapped him? Was she a witch? No one could fathom the truth, that it was a cold, hard business deal. But as the wedding day approached, something strange happened. Kindness began to appear at her door. Mrs. Brennan, the blacksmith's wife, arrived with her arms full of fabric and lace. "If you're doing this," she said, her voice firm, "you're going to look like a bride, not a sacrifice." Soon, other women from the town joined in, a small army of seamstresses descending on the cabin. They took out Margaret's own wedding dress, preserved in lavender and tissue paper. The ivory silk was yellowed, but the lace was still perfect. As they worked, fitting the dress to Nora's slender frame, the cabin filled with a warmth that had been missing for years. Then, Kieran's housekeeper, a stern-looking Scottish woman named Mrs. Holey, arrived with a basket. It was filled with fresh-baked bread, a jar of rich beef broth, and a small bottle of expensive medicine. "Mr. Blackidge sent this," she announced in a thick brogue. "He thought your mother might have an appetite for something proper." The gesture, so simple and thoughtful, brought tears to Nora's eyes. Maybe this man wasn't a monster after all. Kieran himself began to visit in the evenings. He never stayed long. He'd bring a sack of coal or fresh vegetables from his garden. He would sit with Margaret, his deep voice gentle as he asked about her day. He spoke to her with a respect that few people in town ever showed the poor Irish woman. "There is a kindness in him, Nora," Margaret whispered to her one night after he'd left. "It's buried deep, but it's there. You watch for it." One evening, after Margaret had drifted off to sleep, Kieran lingered. They sat in the small, cramped parlor, the silence between them less awkward than it had been. The doctor says your mother is doing better, he said, studying his large hands. The medicine seems to be helping. Thanks to you, Nora said softly. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Blackidge. Kieran, he corrected her gently. If we're to be married, we should use our given names. Kieran. She tried the name. It felt strange on her tongue. Then you must call me Nora. Nora. He said her name as if he were tasting it. It suits you. He looked at her then, his green eyes serious. You are a brave woman, Nora, braver than you know, to sacrifice your future like this. It's not a sacrifice if it's for family, she said, echoing the words she'd told herself 100 times. He was quiet for a long moment. Your mother. She doesn't have much time. The bluntness of it should have hurt, but coming from him, it was just a fact, an honest truth in a world of whispers and lies. I know. What will you do then? He asked, his voice low. When it's just the two of us, in that big empty house? The question hung in the air between them, the real, unspoken part of their bargain. I suppose we'll learn, she said. We'll learn how to not be strangers. The wedding was a small, quiet affair in the parlor of the cabin. Father Miguel officiated. Mrs. Holay and the Brennans stood as witnesses. Kieran arrived in a dark suit that made him look even larger, more powerful. When he saw Nora in her mother's restored dress, something flickered in his eyes, a warmth, an approval, a look she'd never seen from him before. He took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. His vows were simple, a promise to protect and to provide. When Father Miguel said, "You may kiss the bride," a tense silence fell. Then, Kieran gently lifted her chin and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a passionate kiss. It was brief, firm, and surprisingly tender. A promise. Mrs. Blackidge, he murmured against her ear, and a shiver went through her that had nothing to do with fear. From her bed, Margaret watched, tears of joy and sorrow streaming down her face. She had saved her daughter. She had given her a future. Now she could rest. The first morning at the Black Ridge Ranch felt like waking up in a dream. Nora had her own room, a spacious chamber with a soft bed and lace curtains. Across the hall, her mother rested in a proper hospital bed Kieran had ordered from Denver. The change in Margaret was already stunning. Good food, proper medicine, and the absence of fear had brought a hint of color back to her cheeks. Nora found Kieran in the massive kitchen, a ledger open on the table in front of him. He stood as she entered, a gesture of old-world courtesy that surprised her. Good morning, he said. I trust you slept well. Very well, thank you. She felt shy, a stranger in her own home. He had set a place for her. The coffee was hot, the biscuits were fresh. It was more comfort than she had known in years. I'd like to understand my duties, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. This is an arrangement. I intend to hold up my end of it. A faint smile touched his lips. Very well. Mrs. Holay can show you everything. For the next week, Nora learned the rhythms of the house. It was a well-oiled machine, but a lonely one. The dining room could seat a dozen people, but only Kieran ever ate there. The upstairs bedrooms were pristine, empty, waiting for children that had never come. She began to see the man behind the fearsome reputation. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments. He was also profoundly lonely. She found his journal by accident. It had slipped behind his desk in the study. As she picked it up, it fell open. Inside were not just notes on cattle breeding, but sketches. Beautiful, detailed drawings of the landscape, of a hawk in flight, of the wildflowers that grew by the creek. And poems. Words filled with a grief so deep it made her ache to read them. He found her standing there, the open journal in her hand. She expected anger, a flash of the temper the town whispered about. Instead, she saw embarrassment, a raw vulnerability. I'm so sorry, she stammered. It fell. It's all right, he said, taking the journal from her and closing it gently. Old habits. The drawings are beautiful, she said honestly. You have a gift. He looked at her, a strange expression on his face. You think so? I do, she said. My father always said that people who notice the beauty in small things have good souls. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features. It was the first time she'd seen him truly smile. It made him look younger, less burdened. Your father was a wise man. He was, she said, a lump forming in her throat. I think you two would have liked each other. That afternoon, they walked the ranch together. He showed her the apple orchard, the creek that ran through the property. He spoke of his dreams for the land, the years of back-breaking work it had taken to build what he had. It can be lonely, though, he admitted, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. All of this, with no one to share it with. She looked at him then, at this giant solitary man who had saved her. Perhaps, she said softly, it doesn't have to be anymore. Their evenings fell into a comfortable routine. After dinner, they would sit with Margaret, who delighted in teasing her new son-in-law. She drew him out, making him laugh in a way Nora suspected no one had in years. After Margaret went to bed, Nora and Kieran would linger in the parlor, talking. She learned about his childhood, about the wife he had lost, a girl named Sarah with hair like spun gold and a laugh like silver bells. He spoke of the fever that had taken her and their unborn child, and the 15 years of darkness that had followed. He, in turn, learned about her love of books, her quiet strength, her fierce loyalty. He discovered a sharp mind and a resilient spirit beneath her gentle exterior. One rainy night, curled by the fire, he told her a funny story about a stubborn bull, and she laughed. A real, genuine laugh that echoed in the big, quiet room. He stopped talking and just stared at her, his green eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. It is good to hear you laugh, Nora, he said, his voice a low whisper. It is good to have a reason to, she replied, her heart fluttering in her chest. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy. This was no longer just a business arrangement. Something else was growing in the silence of the big house. Something fragile and tentative and beautiful. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The accident happened in a flash. They were riding the fence line by the creek when a rattlesnake spooked Kieran's horse. The stallion reared, throwing Kieran to the ground. He landed hard against the rocky embankment. The sound of bone cracking was sharp and sickening in the crisp November air. Kieran! Nora was off her horse in an instant, scrambling down the rocks, her skirts tearing on the thorns. He was conscious, but his face was pale, his left arm bent at a horrifying angle. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Don't move, she commanded, her voice shaking as she tore strips from her petticoat to make a bandage. She had nursed her mother for years. She knew what to do. As she pressed the cloth to his head, their faces were inches apart. She could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could feel his warm breath on her hand. In that moment, she realized with a terrifying jolt that the thought of losing him was unbearable. Getting him back to the house was an agonizing ordeal. Dr. Henley confirmed her fears. A dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion. You did well, Mrs. Blackidge, the old doctor said. You likely saved him from a much worse fate. That night, she insisted on sitting with him. She entered his bedroom for the first time. It was a stark, masculine space. On his nightstand was a single photograph in a silver frame. A beautiful young woman with golden hair and a radiant smile. Sarah, his lost love. She was beautiful, Nora said softly, helping him settle back against the pillows. His gaze followed hers to the photo. Yes, she was. He told her about Sarah then, about their whirlwind romance and their 2 short years of marriage. He spoke of a love so powerful that losing it had shattered his world. After she died, he said, his voice thick with old pain, I built walls around myself. I thought it was safer to feel nothing than to risk that kind of pain again. But you survived, she whispered. I existed, he corrected her, his eyes finding hers in the lamplight. There is a difference. Until you came, Nora, I didn't think I wanted anything more than that. The words hung between them, a confession more intimate than any touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. And now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Now, he said, his good hand reaching out to cover hers. Now, I am beginning to think that existing is not enough. Just then, her mother appeared in the doorway, leaning on her cane. She had seen the look that passed between them. She settled into a chair by the bed. Kieran, she said, her voice gentle, I know how this marriage began. But you have given my daughter more than just a home. You have given her hope. I haven't seen her truly smile since before her father passed away. For that, an old woman thanks you. Later, after her mother had gone, Nora stayed by his bedside. What your mother said, Kieran whispered in the quiet room. Is it true? Do you have hope? For us? She looked at him, at this broken, beautiful man who had sacrificed so much for her. When I came here, I was just trying to survive, she admitted. But now, yes, Kieran, I have hope. More than I ever thought possible. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a path down his temple. Good, he breathed. Because for the first time in 15 years, so do I. 3 weeks later, Nora made a discovery that blew their fragile new world to pieces. She was dusting the bookshelves in his study when a leather portfolio fell to the floor, scattering papers across the rug. Bank notices, mortgage documents, letters from creditors. With trembling hands, she picked them up. The dates, the numbers, the desperate tone of the letters. They told a story that made her sick to her stomach. Kieran Blackidge was not a wealthy rancher. He was broke. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt. He had taken out loans, sold off cattle, risked everything he had to pay her family's debts. The most recent letter was a final foreclosure notice. He owed the bank $800. He had 30 days to pay, or he would lose it all. What are you doing? His voice from the doorway was sharp. He saw the papers in her hand, and his face hardened. That is my private business. Private? Her voice rose, shaking with a mixture of horror and fury. This says you are about to lose everything. You married me. This is our home. How is that not my business? It is my problem to solve, he said, his jaw tight. You lied to me, she cried, tears streaming down her face. You let me believe you were rich. You let me think I was making a fair bargain. Instead, I have ruined you. Nora, you have ruined nothing, he said, his voice softening at her anguish. These troubles started long before you came here. But you made them worse. For me, for my mother. She threw the papers onto his desk. Why, Kieran? Why would you do that? He didn't answer for a long moment. He walked to the window, staring out at the land he was about to lose. Because I couldn't stand to see you suffer, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Because I had been watching you for months. I saw your strength, your kindness. I saw you. He turned to face her, his green eyes raw with a truth he had hidden for too long. I think I was already in love with you, Nora, before you ever knocked on my door. Your proposal? It was an excuse. A way to have you in my life. The confession struck her dumb. He had loved her. All this time. He had sacrificed everything, not for companionship, but for love. Before she could process the revelation,
There was a knock on the study door. Mrs. Hole peered in. "Beg pardon, Mr. Blackidge. There's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Morrison from Denver. He says it's urgent."
Nora looked at Kieran, her mind reeling.
"See him?"
She whispered.
"We need a miracle."
Maybe this is it. The man in the parlor was slick and well-dressed, with the predatory smile of a wolf. "Mr. Blackidge," he said, getting straight to the point. "I represent the Colorado Cattle Consortium. We are expanding. We want to buy your ranch." "It's not for sale," Kieran said, his voice flat. Morrison's smile widened. "Everything is for sale, for the right price. We are prepared to offer $15,000, cash." The number was staggering. It was salvation. It would pay their debts 10 times over. It would give them a new life. But Nora saw the look on Kieran's face. This ranch was his life's work. His soul was in this soil. "I'll need to discuss it with my wife," Kieran said, his face an unreadable mask. "Don't take too long," Morrison said, a veiled threat in his voice. "Our offer won't be on the table forever." After he left, the silence in the parlor was deafening. $15,000, Nora whispered. It would solve everything. "And it would end everything," Kieran said, his voice rough. "This ranch is all I am." "What good is a ranch if the bank takes it anyway?" she pleaded. Before he could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway, leaning on her cane. She had heard everything. "Forgive an old woman," she said, her blue eyes sharp. "But I have a question. This Mr. Morrison, why is he so eager to buy this specific piece of land? And how did he know you were in financial trouble?" The questions hung in the air, planting a seed of suspicion. The miracle felt less like a gift from heaven and more like a carefully laid trap. The very next morning, Doc Henley rode up to the ranch, his face grim. He'd overheard a conversation in town. "It's the railroad," he announced without preamble. "Morrison's consortium isn't buying land for cattle. They're buying the right-of-way for the new Denver and Rio Grande line. Your ranch, Kieran, is the last piece of the puzzle they need." The trap had been sprung. Morrison knew the land was about to become incredibly valuable. He had used their desperation to try and steal it for a fraction of its worth. "There's more," Doc Henley said, his voice low. "Other ranchers who refuse to sell. They've had some bad luck. Fences cut, a barn burned down. It's not just business, Kieran. These men are dangerous." The news hit them like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting a bank now. They were fighting a powerful, ruthless corporation that would stop at nothing. That night, Nora and Kieran had their first real fight. He was determined to stand his ground, to fight for his home. She was terrified they would be killed. "It's just land, Kieran!" she cried. "Your pride isn't worth our lives." "It's not pride, Nora!" he roared back, the first time he'd ever raised his voice to her. "It's our home. I will not be bullied off my own land." Margaret's calm voice cut through their anger. "Fighting each other will not help. You are both right. The land is worth fighting for. And your lives are worth more than any land. The question is there a way to do both?" Her words cleared the air. They had to be smart. They had to fight back, but not with fists or guns. They had to fight with the truth. "Judge Harrison," Kieran said, an idea dawning. "He's the territorial judge. If anyone can help us, he can." "I'm coming with you," Nora said, her chin set with a new determination. "This is my fight too." They rode into town together, a united front. Judge Harrison listened to their story, his brow furrowed with concern. "The railroad has powerful friends," he warned them. "But they are not above the law. Your best weapon is community. If you can get your neighbors to stand with you, it becomes much harder for them to use these tactics." They rode back to the ranch as the first snowflakes of a coming storm began to fall. The world was turning white, quiet, but they knew a different kind of storm was about to break. That night, standing in his study, Kieran took Nora's hand. "I am sorry," he said. "I put you in danger." She looked at him, at the love and fear warring in his eyes. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You gave me a home. You gave my mother peace. Now, we will fight for it. Together." The riders came at dawn, 6 of them, led by Morrison, their dark coats stark against the fresh snow. They were no longer pretending to be businessmen. Their hands rested on the butts of their pistols. "Kieran," Nora whispered from the window, her heart pounding. He was already strapping on his own gun belt. "Stay inside with your mother," he commanded. But Margaret was already in the hallway, leaning on her cane, her eyes blazing with an old-world fire. "This is my home, too," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I will not hide." Morrison didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've come for your final answer, Blackidge." "The answer is no," Kieran said from the doorway. Morrison sneered. "That's a shame. Accidents happen out here. A fire, a stampede. It would be a tragedy for such a lovely lady to get hurt." It was a direct threat. Kieran's hand moved to his gun, but Margaret stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "I am an old woman. I have seen bullies like you my entire life. You think your money makes you powerful, but you are nothing but a coward." Morrison was taken aback by the frail woman's defiance. But before he could respond, Margaret played her trump card. "I find it interesting," she said, her voice deceptively sweet, "that Judge Harrison is launching a full investigation into the consortium's business practices. Fraud, intimidation, those are serious crimes." It was a bluff, but a brilliant one. A look of uncertainty flashed across Morrison's face. He wasn't used to being challenged. "You have 3 days," he snarled, his mask of civility gone. "After that, all bets are off." As they rode away, the family knew they had only bought themselves a little time. But it was enough. Word spread through the valley like a brush fire. The story of Kieran and Nora's stand, of Margaret's courage, rallied their neighbors. By noon, a dozen ranchers had ridden to the Blackidge Ranch. Men who had been feuding for years over water rights now stood side by side, their rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They had all been threatened by Morrison. They were all ready to make a stand. Judge Harrison arrived, not as a judge, but as a citizen, lending his presence to their cause. And then, as they planned their defense, Margaret, quiet in her corner, revealed the final, beautiful twist. She held up the marriage certificate. "This," she said, her voice filled with triumph, "is our real weapon." Kieran and the judge looked at her, confused. "Under territorial law," she explained, her eyes twinkling, "a wife has joint ownership of all marital property. The bank can have a claim against Kieran, but they cannot foreclose and seize this ranch without the consent of the wife, without Nora's signature." The room erupted. It was a loophole, a legal shield. Morrison's entire plan depended on a quick foreclosure. A lengthy court battle would ruin his timeline and expose his scheme. When Morrison returned that afternoon, he didn't find a terrified family. He found a porch full of armed, determined ranchers and a territorial judge. He tried to bluster, to threaten, but his power was gone. The final blow came when Nora stepped forward, the marriage certificate in her hand. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I am Mrs. Blackidge. This is my home, and I do not consent to its sale." Defeated, Morrison retreated, his threats ringing hollow. The community had won. They had stood together and faced down the monster. 6 months later, spring had returned to the valley. The railroad was coming, but on fair terms, paying the ranchers what their land was truly worth. The Blackidge Ranch was safe. Nora stood on the porch, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her pregnant belly. Kieran came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her. Their life, born from desperation, had blossomed into a deep and quiet love. Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep a few months earlier, her last days filled with peace and the knowledge that her daughter was happy and safe. Kieran led Nora to the small hill behind the house, to her mother's grave. Resting on the simple headstone were 2 plain gold wedding bands. "Nora," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that still humbled her. "Our first marriage was a bargain, a necessity. I want to ask you now, with no debts, with no desperation, will you marry me again? For love?" Tears streamed down her face as she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes." They exchanged the rings right there, under the wide open sky, with the mountains as their witness. Their story became a legend in Cedar Ridge, a tale of how 2 broken people, a desperate girl and a lonely giant, found each other in the darkness and built a love strong enough to move mountains and to stop a railroad in its tracks. They had learned that sometimes the greatest sacrifices lead to the most beautiful rewards, and that a home is not just built with wood and stone, but with courage, community, and a love that refuses to be broken. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We have a new story coming tomorrow and you won't want to miss it.